My name is Tovia Singer, Director of Outreach Judaism. I'm here to answer a question that's asked frequently, and that's regarding the Prince, who is the Messiah that we find in the book of Ezekiel, and his role at the end of days. The last section of Ezekiel is devoted to describing Achros Hayamim, the final days, the end of days. In these passages, we will find some of the most detailed prophecies of the end of days. We're introduced to the Messiah. He's called the Prince in Ezekiel 34, verse 24. David will be a prince among them. And then we're going to see many passages that will discuss the Prince that will follow, more than 20 of them. He's called David not because the Messiah is David, but rather he's a descendant of David, and most importantly, he's the fulfillment of all the promises, the Davidic covenant made to King David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 through 16, where there God promises David that his descendants will remain on the throne and will rule over the Jewish people. They are the true heirs to the Davidic dynasty, and that's what the Messiah is. He's the final heir to this promise that God made to King David, his grandfather, and that's what he's called throughout these passages. The Messiah, who is the Prince, he's going to have a duty, and that is a role to ensure that the sacrifices and offerings will be brought in the temple. This presents an enormous problem for the church because, after all, the book of Hebrews, chapter 10, insists that, in fact, the sacrificial system, namely the system of using animals for sacrifices, has come to an end, will never return again. You'll find that in Hebrews 10, 5, 6, 18, that Jesus died, and therefore he died for sin once and for all, and there will never again be an animal sacrificial system. Paul advances that idea in the book of Romans, chapter 6. Of course, these claims are completely incorrect. As I mentioned, the Bible tells us very clearly, written 500 years before the advent of Christianity, that there will be a restoration of the sacrificial system in the Messianic age. And in fact, among the many sacrifices that will be offered will be the sin offering. And you'll see that Ezekiel 45 tells us that it'll be the role of the prince to ensure that all the many sacrifices, most had nothing to do with sin, they had to do with festivals for new moon. Ezekiel says that the prince himself will ensure that these burnt offerings, grain offerings, drink offerings, the offerings of the new moon will be restored. In fact, among those sacrifices will be the sin sacrifice. Now, there will be priests that will officiate, the descendants of Sudah. That was the earliest high priest during the temple in King Solomon. His descendants were given the honor and role of being the future priests in the temple to handle the most elaborate and honorable rituals, sacrifices that are brought there. So, although the prince makes sure that these sacrifices are provided for, if you look a little further at Ezekiel 45 verse 19, we are told there that, in fact, the priest takes the blood of the sin offering and puts it on the doorposts and the corners of the upper ledge of the altar and on the gateposts of the inner post. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, this poses an enormous problem for the church of why would the animal sacrifices return? It actually presents even a larger problem of why would the sin sacrifice come back? If Jesus was the final sacrifice for all time, if he died for sin, why would there be an animal sacrifice returning? Of course, Jesus did not die for anybody's sins, and that's why the sacrificial system in its full glory is going to return. Some Christians claim that, in fact, it's a memorial. The sin sacrifice of the future is somehow a memorial to sacrifice of the past. This isn't the case at all. What we do is we always appeal to the Bible. Scripture tells us again in the same chapter, in verse 20 of 45, that in fact the sin sacrifices are for unintentional sins. This is exactly the same type of sacrifice we'd find in the Torah, Leviticus chapter 4, where the sin sacrifice, the Korban is for unintentional sins. And in fact, in verse 22, and this is the most astonishing statement, at least for a Christian it would be astonishing, for a Jew this makes all the sense in the world. On that day the prince will provide a bull offering as a sin offering for himself and for all the people of the land. Again, this is a monumental problem. This is a staggering problem for the church. To the religious Jew, of course the prince is going to be offering a sin offering for himself and the people. But for Christianity, Jesus doesn't need a sin offering. After all, he's a sin offering. Jesus doesn't sin. Why would he need a sin offering? So this is a monumental issue because we know already that the sin offering has nothing to do with some sort of retrospective memorial for the past, but in fact it's for unintentional sins in the future. Moreover, we find a little further on that the Messiah is going to bring a Passover lamb. Why would he do it if, in fact, he is the Passover lamb? None of this makes any sense in Christianity. For a Jew, this makes all the sense in the world. There is a question that's often asked, and that is, why would there be sin sacrifices in the future Messianic age? After all, isn't sin supposed to come to an end? Rebellion is supposed to end. It means in the Messianic age, the whole world will know about the God of Israel. People will be acting in a way that's righteous and faithful. They're not going to live in a way that's filled with sin. They're not going to turn against the God of Israel. Why would there ever be a sin offering during a time when the knowledge of God will cover the world as the water covers the sea? Isaiah 11. As everyone will know about God, from the least of them to the greatest. What role can any sin offering have? Well, the answer is exquisite. The sin offering is not for sins of rebellion. The sin sacrifice is for sins that are committed accidentally. People are not going to change in terms of habit. People make mistakes of habit. They make unintentional errors all the time. People forget. That's their nature. The sin sacrifice is for sins that are committed unintentionally. What that means is the person didn't intend to rebel against God, but they were just making mistakes. The normal human error, which a person has to be more aware of. There's no place for recklessness in God's world, but there is a place where they can turn their lives around. This doesn't apply just to the people, but the Messiah himself is going to make mistakes, and therefore he's going to need a sin offering. How do I know that? Because my Bible says so. And now we know a little bit more about the Messianic age and the Prince, the Messiah, who we are told is going to be an extraordinary man of God. He's going to lead the people, and he's going to bring sacrifices. He's going to have a family, children. We'll find that a little bit later in Ezekiel chapter 46, verse 16 through 17. You're listening to Tovia Singer. My Outreach Judaism is the organization. Thank you for listening.
אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ועת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך